Hello, welcome to the Gaston College Department for EMS Education. Today we're going to look at the inclusion of simulation training in EMS through the eyes of the diffusion of innovation theory publicized by Rogers in 2003. Rogers identified several different stages that adopters exist. The first stage is innovative leaders. This accounts for about 2% of people, and these are your risk-taking people. And in our case, it would be the people that will actually develop the equipment and the simulation aids to use for training. The next group that we have are early adopters. These are your opinion leaders, the people that call on others to follow them in the educational field, and we see this as the pioneering Paul and Patty. They're trying to lead the way in the use of simulation. The next we have is the early majority. This is the fall in live, Fred and Flo. This is the group of people that say, yes, this is a useful tool. We want to utilize simulation in EMS. We think there's a benefit, and we're going to sign on to it. Then we have the latter half of people, the late majority, which comprises of about 34% of people. And these are the people that are the wait and seers. Does the simulation actually work? They're the ones that come up with, they play devil's advocate with all the things that could go wrong, might go wrong, why they shouldn't use it. But eventually they do come around and kind of out of peer pressure agree to utilize simulation technology in their educational pursuit. The last group are your last adopters or your late adopters, sometimes called your laggards. And this is about 16% of people. In this group of people, just no matter what you do, you're just not going to convince them of the value of using simulation in training in EMS. These are your really holdouts. They're always going to find something wrong. They'll point to any failures as validation as to why their point of view is correct. And that pretty much comprises the entire group of people that we look at in a simulation process. We're going to look at the first half of people, the positive side, the simulation onboarders. And these are the people, the innovators that are involved in that product design. They come up with how the mannequin may work, the parts and pieces in the mannequin. They develop the actual simulations. They program it. They try to make it as realistic as possible. Also in this early majority group are your people that are tech savvy. Most men really like electronics and technological things, laptops, TVs, that kind of stuff. So if it's electronic, this group of people is going to latch onto it and decide to integrate it. That early majority begins to look at it and see, hey, we can use simulation training as a standard. We can come up with the same scenario, present it the same way to students, and standardize that whether we're teaching it or another group is teaching it. This also leads into the assessment of the student, where we can maybe be more fair in our assessment, where we present that same simulation to a different group of students so they can be evaluated on the same scenario, the same situation. Studies have showed so far that there's improved student performance when simulation is used in EMS training. It's a low-stake environment. If they make a mistake, obviously the patient's not going to be injured, there's not going to be hurt. If they fail, nobody dies. So from that standpoint, the patient or the student is more relaxed and is able to take care of the patient in a better manner. And as a result, they retain the information better and can perform better later. The teaching strategy that kind of goes along with this is the fact that to bring people along to this point, there's several key aspects. We have to present why it's important. We have to persuade people why it's important. We have to get them to use the simulation technology and then promote its positivity so that we can maybe move that curve of the innovators up a little bit so we have more positive people on board and buy into the use of simulation in EMS training. But of course, there's going to be the other half of people, the resistance, those that don't want to embrace the new technology. These are the people that look at simulation creation as time-consuming and difficult. They have maybe a decreased comfort level with technology. They're going to point to the cost of the materials, the mannequins, the labor involved, and say that that's a problem. And then eventually they're going to argue that, hey, dealing with a real-life patient is better than dealing with a simulated patient, because that person, that student now has to deal with more variables that are weaned out through a simulation process. And then their final argument may be that it removes stress from the training situation. Since we're dealing with a mannequin and we don't have that fear of, oh, if I make a mistake, I might harm or hurt this patient, then they say it's not real life, it's not good training, because there's not the stress upon the student to perform, and therefore it's not a good practice to use simulation. In the end, the way to win this group of people over, this resistance group, is to modify the program, take their input and move it into the positive realm. There are some valid points to some of the things that they would say, but if you allow some flexibility in setting up a simulation program, modify it, then you can bring on board, hopefully, those folks that are in the late adopters or even the laggards. From a biblical viewpoint, there are several examples in the Bible. As an innovator, I think Jesus is probably the ultimate innovator. He came, created the church. He changed the religion of the day, made a new covenant with his people. So that was innovation. And while he was on earth, he surrounded himself with some disciples and went around and taught people. And some readily accepted him as Jesus the Christ, where others did not. Mary Magdalene, I would say, would fall in that category of the early adopter. She broke the fragrance and poured it on him. She wiped his feet, in many ways demonstrated that Jesus was Christ in her belief in him, and she was chided for that. But she was kind of the cheerleader, so to speak, of this is Jesus the Christ. The early majority, folks, I would say, would be Peter. What does the Bible say in Matthew 16:18? Jesus tells Peter that he's going to be the rock upon which he builds his church. So, yes, there's some initial hesitancy. There's even some initial failure. But eventually, Peter is on board 100% and leads and becomes the primary cheerleader of the new church. The late majority, I would say, would be simulated by Paul. Paul actually persecuted the church. He did everything to stop this religion from spreading. And it wasn't until God intervened, big bright light, knocks him down, makes him go get information, gives him a vision, that he then is convinced, hey, this is right, and he gives his 100% effort now into promoting Jesus the Christ. Probably the last example I would use would be Jonah the laggard. And Jonah just didn't want to do what God asked him to do. God gave him good reasons, tried to convince him. What did Jonah do? Runs and swallowed up by a whale. Lives in a whale for 3 days. Got to be a horrible experience. If you would think that would convince you, hey, I need to do what I'm supposed to do. The whale spits him out. He goes to Nineveh. He preaches, but then continues to complain to God because he's still unhappy about having to do this whole process. And so Jonah is, to me, is that example of that laggard that just doesn't, they're just never going to 100% please him. Did he grudgingly eventually do what God commanded? Yes, but not without some resistance. From a system standpoint, from bringing in simulation into EMS training, we have to realize that we deal with all of these type of people, and Jesus did as well. He did not ignore one group or the other. As a matter of fact, he took his time to meet each person at where they were in that adaptation. He could have given up on Peter. Peter denied him 3 times, but he didn't. He could have said, Paul is just never going to change. Doesn't matter what I do, but he didn't. He could have just let the whale swallow Jonah and digest him, and that would be the end of Jonah, but he didn't. God does not give up on any of these categories. Jesus met each person in the way they were and utilized his tools to bring the Holy Spirit to influence them to do what God wanted them to do. In the same token as us, as system leaders, need to meet each one of these groups of people where they are and use our influence in a positive way to bring about the end result that we want.